To review its measures to deal with and prosecute these cases. The Ahmed Kathrada Foundation has welcomed the move.
There can't be reconciliation without justice. The fact is, however, that this was a final recommendation and decision of a TRC process. And to have concluded the work of the TRC, that this work should have been done. And that it is being done, albeit this late, doesn't make it doesn't reduce its level of importance and necessity.
And we continue this conversation now with Neeshan Balton, who is the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, whom you've just seen there. A very good evening to you, Mr. Balton. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Perhaps we should just start with the significance of this particular moment in our country's transitional agenda. And, how should South Africans receive the news that a decision has finally been made?
No, I think that, and I'm not sure which decision you're talking about.
I'm talking about the decision, the fact that there are prosecutors that have been appointed, 64 cases that have been identified. I mean, it's been, there've been a lot of complaints within society about the slow process of justice when it comes to what came out of the TRC.
Well, we must always remember that there were about 300 odd cases that were referred to the prosecuting authorities by the TRC at the end of its process around about 96, 97, and that it has taken this long to get to this point, I think is what has been the general issue of concern. However, we are where we are now, so we should be welcoming the initiatives that have been taken and acknowledge that this has come about because of the work by people like Imtiaz Kaji, the Foundation for Human Rights, family and friends of many of the deceased, whose inquest findings they wanted to have overturned, and in the case of the Timor case, that's been done successfully, and that's laid the basis for the pressure on all these other cases to be reviewed, and hence the appointment of the people that you referred to, and especially that of Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza, to review the processes that are going to unfold by the NPA. So this is very welcome news.
Yes, and this is why, as you say, that it's been a long time coming, and I was saying a decision has finally been made. The strategic importance of Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza in this role, and I understand that he's got 3 months to do his work, but if you could just share with South Africans and perhaps some of those who are not familiar with his history, why it is such an important decision appointing him.
Well, Dumisa Ntsebeza was the lead investigator for the TRC. So if there's anybody who knows firsthand the range of atrocities, the scale of atrocities, and where the likely culprits might be for the atrocities that have now to be prosecuted, it would be him. But I think one of the important issues that was made in the statement released by the NPA is that he has to review the processes that are underway, but also to look at where there might have been instances of executive interference in the work of the TRC and of the NPA in undertaking these prosecutions. And that, I think, is the most important part for me, at least. If Dumisa Ntsebeza can begin to identify where those loopholes were, and if possible, to identify the people who might have delayed this kind of prosecutorial work, it will help immensely to ensure that this is never repeated, but also that those people are held accountable for having delayed work that needed to have been done almost 20 years ago.
And when we talk about executive interference, again, just looking back historically, there was at the onset of democracy a point where South Africa is part of a government of national unity. So where would the fingers be pointed at, and what kind of interference would have been possible at that time?
It's very difficult to say, but I would suspect that it would start off from the kinds of people who made up the prosecuting authority at the time. Many of them would have come from the old apartheid system itself, who could possibly have delayed work. But it might also have been that there was political pressure by the new dispensation not to have moved on these cases in the interest of what it might have thought to be reconciliation at the time. But whatever the reasons were, and whoever the people were involved, I think it would be very useful if Dumisa Ntsebeza were able to identify these people, and if his report were able to name them, and also identify the instances of this interference that has now been mentioned by the NPA directly.
And one of the things he's also charged with, Advocate Ntsebeza, of course, is to identify or find evidence of violation of the NPA Act. What would constitute that, and particularly in that context?
I'm not too au fait with the details of that act, but I would assume that it would be hindrance of the prosecutorial work, investigations work, and it's within the entire chain of looking at all of the 300 plus cases that were referred to it and why those were in fact not dealt with. So it can be anything from just laziness to actual interference and stifling of work that needed to have been done, or even to the extent of clear-cut political instructions for this work not to have been undertaken. And hence, I think that is really is of huge significance that this has been added to his brief and to his mandate.
And all of this emanating from a 2019 North Gauteng High Court decision, also saying that the NPA needed to assure the public that there'd be no political interference when dealing with the TRC-related cases. But it's also about ensuring that there are checks and balances that are in place. As the foundation, what would you recommend? And I think the sad part of this history is that it was such a painful moment back then, listening to some of the testimonies, but it's been eroded by time, even though it's such an ingrained part of the fabric of modern day society.
I think the time that has lapsed will have huge impact on the cases that have to be investigated. Many of the people would have passed on. But I think there are significant numbers of lower ranks who might still be alive to share information that allows the NPA and perhaps the country as a whole to perhaps not have the full picture, but as many pieces of the puzzle as possible, so as to form as complete a picture for each and every individual case. And remember, each and every case will be different, but they would have been carried out within the framework of the policies of a state and by people employed by that state using its apparatuses and systems at the time. So all of the individual cases put together will give us a better understanding of who did what and why it was done. And perhaps it won't allow us to understand who exactly finally gave the orders and who was there when each and every individual was either killed or harmed in terms of whatever the nature of the case might be. I can only hope that the work that is going to be done will be of the highest professional standard with the thoroughness that each and every case deserves. Because if not, I think it will do a great disservice to this important step that has now been taken.
The checks and balances, once again, I'll go back to that to ensure that there are no constitutional breaches, but more importantly, to ensure that, everybody who suffered under the apartheid systems, whose cases were before the TRC, are actually treated with equally, because there has been a valid complaint in the public domain that there are only certain people whose tragedies are brought to the fore, either because they were politically notorious or they belong to the right political party, but there seems to be a hierarchy and imbalance of the pain suffered by many South African families.
No, I'm not sure if I share that view. I think if we look at where a lot of the impetus for this comes from, it's from families of victims of many of these massacres and assassinations. And it has taken one or two cases to show that it is possible to overturn inquest decisions. On the basis of that, you now have the possibility of a much more wider scale investigation and a wider scale of people who stand likely to be brought to justice and prosecuted. And it always starts with a few cases to show that things are possible. Without those few test cases, I doubt the NPA would have moved. I doubt we would have had the South Gauteng High Court decision. And I doubt you would have had the kind of political world that now seems to be emerging in the NPA and in government as a whole to ensure that this work is completed. I don't know who the 64 cases are. I can only hope that it's 64 cases, that there is proper evidence, that there is the necessary information to start the work, which ultimately must lead to some kind of decision on all the 300 plus cases that were referred to the NPA by the TRC.
I think that's absolutely the point, that a light is shone on every single important player in the liberation struggle who fought and unfortunately was subjugated by the system, and whose family suffered as well. Neeshan Balton is the Executive Director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. Thank you so much for your time. We're going to leave it there for now.